In this video, I'm going to be covering everything you need to know about Redis, starting with what Redis is, moving on to how to install it, all of the commands you need to know, and then finally ending up with a real-world example of how you would implement Redis yourself. And this is a really important video to watch because Redis can be included in every single production level application, and it's going to make your application more performant. So let's get started now. Welcome back to Web Dev Simplified. My name's Kyle, and my job is to simplify the web for you so you can start building your dream project sooner. So if that sounds interesting, make sure you subscribe to the channel for more videos just like this. Now, Redis is essentially a type of database, and more specifically, it is a NoSQL database, but it's not very similar to any other NoSQL databases. It's definitely not similar to MongoDB, and it's obviously very different than SQL databases like Postgres and MySQL. And this is because Redis doesn't really have any idea of tables or documents, and instead, all of the data in Redis is stored inside of key value pairs. So think about a JSON object. You have the key name, and you have the value Kyle. This is essentially a key value pair, and Redis is just like one giant JSON object that has key value pairs, and that's all that you have inside of Redis. So it's not very good at storing a bunch of structured data like you have in SQL, but it's really good for storing, individual key value pairs that you need to access or get data from. Another important thing to note about Redis is that unlike a normal database that runs on your disk and stores all your information on disk, Redis actually runs inside of your working memory, your RAM on your computer. And this means that Redis is incredibly fast because it's all working inside of RAM, but it's much more volatile because if all of a sudden your system crashes, you're going to lose everything that's in Redis unless you're backing it up consistently, which is why Redis is generally not used as like an actual persistent database store like you have with MongoDB and Postgres, and instead it's used more for caching, where you take things that are really, things that you access a lot or things that take a long time to compute, and you store those values inside of Redis. That way, when you need to access them in the future, it's incredibly quick. Since Redis is in the memory already loaded, it's milliseconds to get data as opposed to hundreds of milliseconds or even seconds of time to get data from a traditional database. Really, the important thing to realize about Redis is that it's going to be built on top of a traditional database almost always. You're going to have your MongoDB or Postgres database in the background, and you're going to have Redis sitting in front of that database. And any time that you have a really long or slow query to your database, or you have data you access all the time but doesn't change that much, what you're going to do is you're going to store that data inside of Redis as well as inside your database. And then when you go to get that information, if it's already in Redis, you can access that data in milliseconds as opposed to going all the way to the database, computing the data, and then coming all the way back, which is going to take you hundreds to even thousands of milliseconds, depending on how complex your data is. So Redis is going to take your app and make it hundreds to even thousands of times faster when it comes to querying these pieces of information. This is going to become very apparent at the end of this video when we take the real-world application, and we're going to speed this application up by about 10 to 50 times just by implementing Redis. So with that said, let's actually talk about how we can install Redis. Installing Redis on your computer is really simple if you have a Mac or a Linux computer. If you use Mac, just use Homebrew to do the install, and if you're on Linux, just use your package manager of choice to install it. It's just called Redis. It's that simple. But if you're on Windows, it's a bit more complex because there is no way to install Redis on Windows. Instead, you need to go through the Windows subsystem for Linux, which is pretty simple to install. I'll include a link down in the description on how to install it. And once you do, essentially you can run Linux on your Windows machine super easily. So as you can see, I am currently inside of a Linux terminal using the Windows subsystem for Linux on my computer. And then all you need to do in order to install this, if you're using Ubuntu, is just say sudo apt-get install, and then just type in Redis. And then you need to type in your password that you set up for your account, and it's going to go through and install the Redis for me. For you, it'll take a little bit longer to download, but I already have it downloaded, so it's pretty quick. And then once you get it installed, just type in redis-server. This is going to start up your Redis server, and as you can see, it just prints out a bunch of information, and it says running in standalone mode on port 6379, and that's just the default port for Redis. So now Redis is running on port 6379. So in order to access Redis, we just need to open up a new terminal. And if you're on Windows, make sure you open up a Windows sub Linux terminal here. And then we can just type in redis-cli. And now we can actually access Redis and run commands kind of like you could do in Node with a CLI. So for example, one thing that we could do inside of here is just type quit, and that exits us out of the CLI. Obviously we want to be in the CLI though. So the very first thing we can do is add things to our database. Because like I said, this is a key value pair database. So the main things that you're going to do is setting a value for a key and getting a value for a key. So we can type in set, and it can be all uppercase, all lowercase, it doesn't matter. Generally, the idea though is to use all capitals. Then we're just going to type in our key. Our key is just going to be name, and we'll put in a value of Kyle. And then we hit enter, and you can see it said okay. To check to see if this worked, we can type in get and the name of our key, which is just name, and as you can see, we get the value of Kyle being returned back to us. And you'll notice something about Redis is that pretty much everything you store inside of Redis is going to be a type of string by default. So if we set, for example, age equal to 26, and then we come here and we get our age, you're going to notice it comes back as this kind of string type. Technically, Redis is smart enough to know this is an integer, but it really doesn't matter because when you're accessing and dealing with these things, they're pretty much always going to come back to you as strings when you're dealing with Redis. Now with Redis, we can also do a delete. So I could say, delete age. And now if I do get age, you can see it returns to me null here because there is no age at all because I deleted that key. So we can set keys, we can get keys, and we can delete keys. And finally, we can also just have this command called exists. And this is just you type in a key, for example, name. Whoops, if I spell name correctly. And you can see it returns to us 1, saying that this is true. And when I typed name incorrectly, it returns 0, which means false. So you can determine whether or not this key exists or not. So that's kind of like the most basic things that you can do inside of Redis for setting, getting, deleting, and checking if they exist. Also, what you can do is check to find all the keys that match a certain pattern. So if you just put star, this is going to get you all the keys. Right now, we only have one key, which is name. So that's why it's returning to us name. This is a great way just to see what's inside of your database. You can also get rid of everything in your database by just typing flush all, hit enter. And now when we check our keys, you're going to notice we have no keys at all. And this is a really great way to just clear everything out. If you're having problems with your caching, you can just clear the entire cache and now there's nothing at all inside of it. But I can go back and I can say set name Kyle. And then I can get name, and as you can see, it's returning to me that name. Also, if you want to just clear out the input, just type the word clear. That's going to clear everything out for you. And then a few additional things that I really want to talk about is the idea of expiration. So if we just type in TTL and then the key name, which in our case is name, this stands for time to live. And as you can see, this time to live is -1. That just means it has no expiration at all. It's going to live forever. But you can actually make keys so that they expire at some point. I could, for example, type in expire and then name, and I want it to expire in 10 seconds. And now when I check the TTL for name, you can see that this is constantly counting down. And once it gets all the way down to 0, it's going to completely delete this key. So as you can see, 1, now we're essentially -2. -2 means it is gone. Now, if we do get name, you can see there is no longer anything for this name key because we'd expired it after 10 minutes. And if you want to make sure a key expires when you set it, you can use the command set ex, and that's going to give you a key, in our case, name. We can give it how long we want it to last, let's say 10 seconds, and then the value of Kyle. So it works just like set, but you can actually put the expiration right here. And now when I TTL that name, you can see it's constantly counting down from 10, and once it gets all the way down to 0, it's going to delete that key. Now that covers most of what you're going to be doing inside of Redis since you're mostly going to be dealing with strings, but Redis also has support for handling arrays in the form of list, and they also have hashes for kind of storing like JSON objects. So let's take a list first. In Redis, if you want to add an item to a list, you're going to say L push, and this is going to add an item to the start of your list. That's what the L stands for. It stands for left or start. So we can give our list a name, which is our key. Let's just say friends. And then we're going to give this thing a value that we're pushing on. So let's just push on John here. And now we have a key friends that has John inside of the array of it. So we could say get friends. And you're going to notice it's saying, hey, this is the wrong type. We can't get this. And that's because get only works for strings. If we want to print out a list, what we need to do instead is say L range. Then we say friends, which is the key that we want to get. And then we say we start at index 1 and stop at index -1. That means get all the items in the list. As you can see, we get John being printed out because that's the only thing in the list. Let's push another item to the left or the start of our list. So we can say L push inside of friends because that's the name of our array. And we can say we want to push in Sally here as well. And now if we get all the values, you can see Sally got pushed to the front and then John got added on. Also with these lists, you can push on the end or the right-hand side by using R push. It works the same way as L push, but it's going to add it to the end of the array. So let's put in here, Mike. And if we check this, you can now see that Mike got put onto the end of the array. You can also take items on and off of the array by using something called L pop and R pop. They are going to be the left and the right-hand pop. So L pop, you just type in friends, and it's going to take the first item on the left or the start of our array, take it off and return it to us. So it took Sally away from the array, returned it to us, and now if we look at our array, you can see Sally is gone. If we do R pop of friends, and we now print out our array, you can see it got rid of Mike, which was the last item in our array, so it took out the thing on the right-hand side. A list like this is really useful for any type of queue or stack that you want to have. Like let's say you have a messaging app and you want to cache the 5 most recent messages from a user. Well, you can constantly just push onto that array. So you could do like an L push to push onto the top of the array, and then you could do an R pop to remove the last item. That way you always make sure you have 5 things in there, and it's going to be the most recent 5. And once you get a newer item, it's going to push off the oldest one and put this newest one right on top of it. That'd be a great use case for this list type. The next thing I want to talk about is sets, and sets are very similar to list because they're like an array structure, but it's a unique array. If you know anything about sets inside a JavaScript, which I'll link up a video I've done on them up in the top right in the cards, a set is essentially just a list that is completely unique. Every value in the list is unique, and it's not put in particular order like an array is. So if you want to create a set, you have to prefix everything with s. So we could say like s add, and then we can give it a key. And we'll say here that we have hobbies. And inside of here, we're going to pass in a value. This is very similar to like pushing to an array, but we're adding to the set. So let's just push in here the hobby of weight lifting. And you'll notice I wrap this in quotes if I have more than one word. So now if I want to get all the things inside of here, we can say s members, s members. And this is just going to print out everything inside of that thing. So hobbies is the thing we want to check. And as you can see, we got all the values inside of hobbies being printed out. And like I said, with sets, it's essentially completely unique. So if I try to add weightlifting back in here again, you can see we got 0 being returned saying that it was a false. It could not add this because it's already there. And if we check, you can see it didn't add it. We only have just that one thing inside there of weightlifting. Also, with this, we can do a remove. So we could just say srem, that stands for remove, from hobbies. And we want to remove that value of weight lifting. And now if we check our members, you can see that it's an empty list. There's nothing at all inside of it. Now, finally, I want to talk about hashes, and hashes are just another key value pair. So you can think of it as like a key value pair inside of a key value pair. But with hashes, you can't have hashes inside of hashes. So it's like a JSON object, but you can't have any nesting at all inside of it. It's just one set of key value pairs. So to do anything with hashes, you're going to prefix every command with an H. So if we want to set a value, we could say H set. And let's just say that we want to have a person. The field we want to set is their name, and we want to give it the value of Kyle. So now what we can do is we can say H get, and we want to get person, and we want to get the name from that person, and you can see it returns to us Kyle. And if we wanted to get everything about that person, we could just use get all, type in person, and now you can see we have the key name and the value of Kyle. So it prints out the key first and then the value second. And we can add other things. So if we go back to H set, we can instead set an age. So let's say that we want to do an age set for our person. We want to set the age, and we're going to set it to a value of 26. Now when we do a get all, you can see we have a name of Kyle, and we have an age of 26. And we can get individual properties. So for example, I could say, get just the name, or I could say just the age for that person, or we could do that get all again and get all of the different key value pairs. You can also do an HDEL, which is going to be a delete. So let's say that I wanted to delete the age property, and now I printed everything out. You can see there's only the name right here. And also I could do an exist. So I could say H exists, and I could say person and name, and you can see that returns true with the integer of 1, and age returns false with the integer of 0. So hashes are essentially a great way if you need to store like key value pairs inside of an individual key. But like I mentioned at the beginning, almost everything you're going to be doing inside of Redis is going to be dealing specifically with strings. So you're going to be doing like sets and gets and expirations, and that's like 95% of what you need to do inside of Redis. So speaking of that, let me show you a real world example of how you would take Redis and implement it inside of the backend of an application to speed it up by about 10 to 50 times. So here I have a really simple Express Node.js application with 2 different endpoints. One is for getting all of the photos, and one is for getting an individual folder. And in each one of these endpoints, all that we do is we call out to this JSON placeholder API to get a list of photos, or we call it to get an individual photo. And here we also have the option to pass it an album ID to just limit the size of the list. And this code, you can just imagine this right here could be anything. It could be calling a database, calling some other API. This is just like your main code that runs inside of your server. And this is pretty slow code because there's a lot of data to fetch, and it's calling out to an API, which is always going to be pretty slow. On the right-hand side here, we have my own version of Postman that I created. If you're interested in learning how I created this, I have a whole video on it linked up in the description for you. But if we just query out to HTTP localhost 3000, which if we scroll down here, that is what this server is running on, and we go to /photos, and I click send here, you can see down here we get our response, which has a ton of information inside of it. As you can see, there's essentially 35,000 lines of code inside of here being returned, and it took about 370 milliseconds. And if I do a few more sends, you can see it's around that ballpark of about 300 to 400 milliseconds every time I make this request. And if I get an individual photo, for example, photo 1, click send, you can see it's quite a bit faster because there's a lot less data, but it's still taking, almost 100 milliseconds for this to run. And this photos one is taking quite a while. Like I said, 300 to 400 milliseconds. Now this 300 to 400 milliseconds isn't like the end of the world, but you can imagine a query that takes much longer, maybe 1, 2, 3 seconds to run. And if you have to wait for that every time you load your web page, obviously that's a terrible user experience. So instead what we're going to do is use Redis to cache this information, so that way whenever we make a request after it's been cached, we're going to get it directly from Redis, which is going to be way, way quicker. So let me just come in here and we're going to install Redis. So I'm just going to open up a new tab here. I'm going to say npm I Redis, just like that. It's going to go through, it's going to install Redis for us. Let's go back to where we were before. Now we have our application running and we can import Redis. So we can say const Redis is equal to requiring of Redis. And now that we have Redis here, this is actually going to be essentially like a class that we can use. So we can get an instance of Redis. So we can say that we want to get our client, which is just saying redis.createClient. And inside of here, we can just pass it nothing, and it's going to use all the default parameters. Or you can pass it specifically a URL. So if you're going to push this up to production, you're going to want to pass in the URL for your production instance of Redis. But for our case, we're just using the local host version that's running on the default port. So we can just leave this completely blank, and we actually have access now to Redis. So to make sure that Redis is running, I have a Windows terminal open up over here for Linux. I can just type in Redis server, and that's going to start up Redis. And if we just expand this a little bit, you can see that it's saying it started up Redis, and it's saying that it's accessible. So let's just minimize that back down a little bit. Let's start up our server. We'll say run dev start here, just like that. So our server is running, everything's working, and we have this Redis client. I'll even just rename this to Redis client. Now, in order to use this Redis client, you're going to use it just like you would use normal Redis. So if we come down here, we can say like Redis client.set. That's going to allow us to set. Or we can say set ex, and that's going to allow us to set with an expiration time. Every command I just taught you in Redis is going to be used on this Redis client here. So let's do just a simple set with an expiration. And we're going to say, for this, we want to set something for all of our photos. So we're going to set it with a key of photos like this. And we want to set an expiration. Let's just say that we're going to create a default expiration up here. So we're going to say const default expiration is just going to be like 3,600 seconds. That's essentially the same as 1 hour. So there's our default expiration. And our value for this is going to be the value we get from right here. So let me just bring this down a little bit. And we can say that we want to store the value of data inside of here. Except for this data right here is an array of values. And inside of Redis, we can only really store strings. So we need to make sure we JSON.stringify this to convert this into a string to store it inside of Redis. Now if we save this and we just send on our page here, what's going to happen is nothing new is going to happen. You can see it's still taking, quite a while to do this command, but now we're storing our information inside of Redis with this expiration here, and we're storing this data. So what we can do is we can essentially go over, open up a new terminal tab here. We can say Redis CLI, and we can just say keys star. And as you can see, we have that photos key right here, which has the value of, this 35,000 lines of JSON. Now that's really great, but right now we're not actually getting that information because every time we run this, we're just getting the data and saving it to Redis. What I want to do instead is check, does Redis have this information? And if so, skip essentially all of this code right here. So we can say Redis client.get. And what we want to do is we want to get something with the ID or with the key here of photos. And then this is going to take in a callback that has an error, and it also has our data. In our case, our data is just all of our different photos, but they're going to be as a string. So what we need to do is if we have an error, then I just want to essentially console.error out the error. Now the next thing I want to do is check to see if we have some photos. So if our photos is not equal to null, well then that means that we had some data returned to us. So we can actually use that data to return down to our user. So we can essentially just say here return res.json, and we want to json.parse these photos, because remember this is returned to us as a string. So if we have photos already saved, just return them down to the user. Otherwise, what we want to do is we want to get that data and we want to set it. So we want to take all of the code that we were doing every single time, and now we're only going to run that code to query the API and actually set the data inside of Redis if we don't already have it inside of there. And then obviously we're going to make sure we just JSON that information down. So now all that we've done inside of here is we've wrapped everything inside of this Redis client get. And if we're able to get information, we return it immediately. Otherwise, we go through, we query our database or API, whatever it is, and then send the data down. So now what's going to happen is when I click send over here, you're going to notice something interesting. It looks like when I click send, nothing worked. So if we come over here, you can see we have an error. If I scroll up, it's just saying that this await keyword is not able to be used, and we need to be inside an async function. So let's just make sure this is an async function right here. Now, if I save, you can see we no longer get any errors. We click send, and you can see the time is now 63 milliseconds. So we went from 400 milliseconds down to 60. We click send again, now we're down, 37 milliseconds. It's super, super quick. And that's because we're just pulling this directly from our Redis cache. If I just put a simple console log inside of here that says cache hit, and I'm going to put another console log inside of here that says cache miss. So if we hit the cache and we got it immediately, it's going to print out cache hit. Otherwise, if we didn't, we're going to print out cache miss. As you can see, we're hitting the cache every single time. That's where this cache hit is coming from. Now, if we come over to here, to here where we have our CLI open, we just say flush all. That's going to clear out our entire database. We now no longer have that key, as you can see. So if we go back here, we should see that when we first search, it's going to give us a cache miss. And of course, it's giving us an error. Let's see what this is. It's just saying data is not defined. We have data here, data here, data here. We just need to move this inside of the else. There we go. That should fix that error. So now if we just make sure we clear that back out again, let's just, clear everything. Go back over to here. And now we click send. You're going to see said cache miss, and it took 400 milliseconds. So pretty slow. We click send again, it's a cache hit, and now it only took 36 milliseconds. That is way, way faster. That's 10 times faster immediately right there. And we click send every single time it's going to be a cache hit. Now, one problem with this initial setup though is it doesn't work with this album ID. If I add in a query param for our album ID, and let's just say we do album ID of 2, and I click send, you can see I still get all the albums with ID 1, the albums with ID 87, and so on. And that's because it's still hitting this cache of photos. We need to make sure that our cache key takes into account everything that could change. So for example, if the album ID changes, we want this key here to change. So what I would like to do here is essentially just add in our album ID, and we're just going to put the value of that album ID onto the end of our key. So now our key is for any photo that has an album ID or doesn't have an album ID. The only other thing we have left to do is make sure we use the same key down here where we're actually setting our Redis key. So now if we save this and we test this, if we have an album ID of 2, click send, you can see we get only the things with the album ID of 2. It took about 127 milliseconds. Click send again, now it took 6 milliseconds. I mean, that is way, way, way faster. That's like 20, 30 times faster. If we do an album ID of 3, click send, it takes a long time the first time, but every other time is incredibly quick. And if we have no album ID, click send, it takes a while, and then every other call after that is pretty quick. And we can actually check that by coming over here and just saying keys star. You can see that we have a key for just photos, which is just from before our database. We didn't flush it properly. We have it for when the album ID is 3, when the album ID is 2, and then when we don't have any album ID at all. So this is essentially all the different things being cached inside of our database. This is really great. Now all we have to do is add caching down here to this section of our application. But you'll notice when we do this, that logic is almost identical to what we've done up inside of here. So I want to extract this out into a function I can reuse everywhere that's going to do the caching for me. So what I want to do is just come down all the way here, and we're going to create a function, and we're going to just call this get or set cache. And it's going to take in a key, and it's going to take in a callback. And the callback is what we're going to call to actually get the value for our cache. So inside of here, the first thing I want to do is turn this into a promise, because it's much easier to work with promises. So we're going to return in a new promise that has a resolve, and a reject inside of here. And then we're going to use that Redis client, and we're going to see if we can get a key. So we're going to try to get to that key. And if we can't get to that key, we're going to have here an error and our data. And then what I want to do inside of here is if we have an error, then I obviously just want to reject that error and return. So we don't do anything else at all. Then I want to see if our data is not equal to null. That means we have some data. So I want to resolve that data, and I want to make sure I convert it back into JSON. So we're going to JSON parse this data, since we're constantly converting everything to a string to store it inside of our database. Now, if neither of these are true, then that means that we don't have data. Essentially, we missed our cache. And what I want to do is I want to get fresh data. This either means that we haven't queried this page yet, or it expired after this default expiration here. Essentially, it's just not in our cache. So we're going to call that callback. But the important thing is this callback is going to be asynchronous. So we're going to make sure that we await this callback and make sure that this here is an async function, just like that. Now we're going to have our fresh data. And what I want to do is I want to take my Redis client and I want to set that fresh data. So we can use set.exe for our key. We're going to use that default expiration, and we're going to store in here our brand new fresh data. So now we're saving that inside of our cache. So next time we can take this shortcut and not have to worry about calling this long running callback. And then what I want to do is just resolve that fresh data. And it's important here that this fresh data, I convert this to a string before I store it, since Redis can't really handle something that's not a string. So now we have this handy dandy function called get or set cache. It just takes in a key and a callback that we call if for some reason it doesn't work. So way up here, what we can do is we can say get or set cache. And this is going to return to us essentially some photos. Going to be equal to that. And this is a promise. So we need to make sure that we await that. And in here, we're going to pass it our key, which we can just copy from right here. And then we need to pass it our callback. And the callback is really super straightforward. It's just this callback down here where we're going to be getting our data. So we're getting our data, and then we need to return that data. So our callback is just how do we get the information we want to store in the cache? And this is how we get it. And let's just make sure we return it down here. So now I can take all of this code that we wrote right here, completely get rid of it. And down here, I can just say res.json and send back our photos, since that's what we called this variable right up here. So now if I save this, let's see if this still works. Obviously we have an error. It's saying that await is only valid in an async function. Let's just make sure this is an async function here. Now we have no more errors. I want to go over real quickly and just flush everything from our database. So we have a completely fresh Redis to work with. And let's click send here. And you're going to notice it takes about 427 milliseconds, but the next time it only takes 39. It's storing that in the cache. If we add in the album ID, we add an album ID of 2, for example, click send, you can see 80 milliseconds the first time and 5 the second time, so quite a bit faster. We can try the same thing with 3, and you can see again it down to 4 milliseconds. And if we check our keys over here, you can see we have those 3 different keys for undefined, 2, and 3. So now I want to essentially do the exact same thing. I want to take this code and I will make it work down here. So let's just copy what we have right here. We're going to paste it down inside of here. And instead, our data is going to be got by this query right here, where we're just querying the API with this particular ID. So we're just replacing how we get our data with the data that was right inside of here. And then we're going to change our key, because our key is not going to be based on an album ID. It's going to be based on an ID. So a lot of times in Redis, when you're working with namespaces or with data that has, multiple IDs or multiple entries, you just have the namespace followed by a colon, and then you can put in, for example, the ID, which in our case is request.params.id. So what this is saying is, hey, we have some photos namespace and we're going to get an ID'd value from it. This is just a naming convention. You can use whatever you want. You could put a hyphen in here. You could put an underscore. You could put nothing at all. It just is a nice thing to have here so that we can easily say this is a photo, and the photo has, an ID of 1, for example. And this is going to return to us a single photo, which we're going to return as our data down here. So now with that done, we should hopefully be able to query something like photos/1, click send. The first time it took 126 milliseconds, and the next time it took 6 milliseconds. Let's get photos 3. You can see the first time it was slow, and the second time it's much faster. And every other time after that is going to be very, very fast. And if we check our keys, you can see we have a key for photos:1 and photos:3, which are the 2 different IDs that we checked for. And that is everything you need to know to get started with Redis. If you enjoyed that video and want to figure out how I made that Postman clone, just click over here for that, and also subscribe to the channel for more videos just like this. Thank you very much for watching and have a good day.